it really is all about realigning all the core stakeholders across what used to be silos in the agency, sales, ops, project management, all kinds of different, factions in the agency, and bringing them together, establishing, looking at, knowing that we have the strong data, clean data, knowing that we have a framework that we've already agreed upon, and then getting a process in place to actually make decisions using, all this information.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Today, we are joined once again by Kristen Kelly, who I'm excited to chat with today about, for a lot of you ops nerds out there that are listening, I say that as an endearing label, something you're going to really like, which is the process part of managing agency profitability. So with all of that, Kristen, this is something that you felt compelled to bring to the show as a topic. And so why don't you tee up what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so it's so great to be back. Thanks for having me, Marcel. You and I have been talking a ton about the three-part profitability management system over the past couple conversations. And today, as you mentioned, we're digging deeper into the third piece, which is process. And as a true ops nerd, you're correct. Process is definitely near and dear to my heart. So definitely wanted to take some time to dig deeper today and get into it. So before we do that, I just wanted to kind of level set everyone on three pieces so we can isolate the third. So the first one, obviously, the third piece, or the three pieces in the profitability management system are the right data. So making sure your finance, delivery, and sales tools are producing the data you need. The second part is the right framework, making sure you have a simple set of metrics, the exact formulas for measuring them, and a clear understanding of the relationship between those metrics and your business. And then today, the topic du jour, the right process. So basically a process that ensures data hygiene, adapts seamlessly to change, and supports critical conversations with consistent cadences. So yeah, let's dig into number three.
Let's dig into number three. By the way, for those of you that are new to this framework, I'll leave a link in the show notes to a blog post that I wrote, which is our point of view essentially, and kind of talks through the big idea behind why those three large components, data, framework, process, are really important if you want to get a grip on what we're calling profitability management, which is like the process and the practice of managing profitability in the agency and having visibility into why it's going the way it is and what to do about it. So yes, process. This is probably the most overlooked part of this, to be honest. And it most often is the missing piece when I speak to clients that are interested in working with us. I hear their stories about where they've come from, all the things they've tried that didn't work, that got them to the point where they're so desperate for help that they're willing to get on a call to talk about math with me. And this is most often one of the major pieces that's missing, which is not, first of all, just the mental shift around not thinking about profitability management and running a system like this as a process as opposed to an event. I think so many people make the mistake of going into building reporting systems or switching tools or anything related to wrangling data inside of their organization, and they think, oh, once we set this up and once we get through the implementation process, we'll be done. And the unfortunate reality is that assumes a bunch of things that, in my experience, are never true. It assumes that the way you've set it up is the way people are going to use it. That's often not the case. Data is often messy. People make mistakes. They don't follow the naming convention. They change things. Change is another thing, right? So you're going to change tools. You're going to change what you sell. You're going to change what you call things. You're going to change how the team is structured. You're going to change how you set things up inside the tool or what you're using the tagging system for, or, there's a billion different ways that things can change. And then, of course, the context of the business changes, which makes it really important to have a cadence. So we're looking at the right things at the right time, and we can maintain a level of visibility and alignment that allows us to make decisions that everybody's happy with, and then actually go and execute on those things. So that is a big part of the reason why process is important. but it's also really often overlooked. People are not considering like, okay, once we go through the process of setting up a reporting system or changing our tools, who's going to be responsible for actually owning this thing going forward and making sure that we're staying on top of the things that will eventually chip away at the functionality and value that we get from that initiative.
Yeah. And so if we look at process as really three main things, it's the data hygiene, it's the adaptability to change, and the cadences. I mean, starting with data hygiene, what do we mean by this, at least in Parakeeto's terms?
Yeah. So we're really big on. We'll start with the fundamental assumption that I think is important here, and it's we've talked about this quite a bit on recent episodes, but the first thing that we need to shift our mindset on is to go into this process of managing data, managing profitability with the understanding that data is going to be messy. And we know that this is going to be true because even just if we look at the finance function within the business, right? Getting a P&L and L and a balance sheet together every month, there are human beings that need to spend a considerable amount of time parsing through every transaction, allocating those transactions, doing journal entries, making adjustments. And consider that finance data is almost all machine made, right? So it is so much cleaner at onset because it's created by machines, not human beings. The propensity for inconsistency and error is much lower as a result of that because transactions are, being generated, invoices are being generated using computer systems. So why would we expect time tracking and project data, which is almost completely manually inputted to systems by human beings, to be cleaner than that and to not require at least the same amount of effort, but of course, in our experience, a lot more effort often to get it to a place where it's clean and accurate. And the kinds of things that you're going to see constantly are, hey, the naming convention for the tasks was designer, copywriter, project manager, but we now have 17 permutations of designer in the system because somebody called it design, another person called it UX design, another person called it graphic design, another person called it design team, right? And so we need to have a process to say, okay, let's take all of those variations and normalize them. Or the client's name was misspelled in a bunch of different places, or a person forgot their timer was running while they were on vacation and logged a 99-hour entry, or they selected the wrong project in the system when they were tracking their time and they logged time to a project that ended a year and a half ago, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? These are the things that we see all the time in data, it not being clean, it not lining up. And the long and short is if we set up a system that takes raw data inputted by people and puts it straight into reports, then we're setting ourselves up for failure because we cannot control for perfect data on the input. So our whole philosophy at Parakeeto is we want to use an ETL process, which stands for extract, transform, and load. And the transform part of that is where we want to bring in the data and have a deliberate process every time we're pulling, in particular, time tracking data, but also we need to reconcile that often against people and project data and go through a process of checking for these kinds of things, right? Are there any abnormalities in the data? Are there variances off of the structure that we expect? Are there spelling mistakes? Are there typos? Are there ghost spaces that people accidentally added to the end of things? Like all of these are going to break downstream reporting. And we need to give ourselves in our process the ability to stop, look at those things, take corrective action, and then load that clean data into the reporting system. And ideally do that in a way that doesn't go back into the source system and change the source data. There's a whole bunch of reasons we could talk about on why that's the best practice and why that's important. But at a high level, that's what we talk about when we talk about data hygiene process, is literally having a process to clean data and making sure that we do that every time we get new data in the same way that our finance department has been doing this since the beginning of time.
Yeah. And I think, in terms of outcome there, I think the important thing to really remember is it's all about the reliability of the data that you're looking at. At the end of the day, knowing that it's clean, it's uniform, it's been through that routine process, and we can make solid decisions based on it.
And the other advantage is that it helps with change, which is kind of the next thing that we'll be talking about. But that ETL process has a lot of benefits, and the other one is that in some cases it's not that the data is messy; it's that the data is different. And so we still want to give ourselves the ability to compensate for that as we evolve in the business over time, which is something that we want to be enabled to do because it makes us more nimble and reactive. And as we've learned over the last several years, sometimes you got to change and you got to do it really quickly.
Yeah. So you segued us right into the next one, which is change. And just to kind of clarify, what types of changes we're talking about, it's like, your project management platform changes, your the service offerings that you provide to your clients change. Any number of things that are part of day-to-day agency life are subject to change. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about what Parakeeto thinks of in terms of change.
Yeah. So we'll start with kind of the problem that people experience when they're not paying attention to this, which, if you've ever been the one responsible for doing reporting in your organization, you've experienced this, right? Which is some downstream change occurs. The sales team decides to change the stages in the CRM, or the structure of how they estimate work or send proposals out changes, or the PM team decides, hey, we're going to, instead of setting up projects in the time tracking or project management tool this way, we're going to start structuring them in a slightly different way. And then all of a sudden, you go to pull data in your reporting cadences and you're like, what the hell? This is all completely different. And it doesn't match the things that I was doing before. And you often end up in a situation where you actually don't even really know that until you go to run your process and you realize there's a ref error somewhere in your spreadsheet, or et cetera. And then you have to go kind of parse through all of these things, and often you've designed the system in such a way where you don't really have a lot of options to fix this. And unfortunately, what that often creates is these horizontal seams in reporting, where it's like, okay, well, we used to track this metric, but now we can't compare that metric to the past anymore, and we're just going to have this hard line on this date where it's like, you can either look at this data from this date back or this date forward, but you can't look across. And those things add up over time, and it dramatically undermines the value, the compounding value of measuring things over time. And so managing change is critically important. And our lens on this is, again, the ETL process is a really big part of this. You want to give yourself some tools that allow you to, A, manage this change and normalize things over time, but you also want to have a process for change management that's deliberate. And that often just comes with having someone who is responsible for overseeing this system and maintaining it, so that they're involved in that conversation when it's initially being discussed and can call out the implications and help facilitate the process. So it's never a surprise when it lands on their plate. They knew it was coming, and they could help manage that change in such a way that it's setting everyone up for success. So, for example, the project management team says, hey, we want to switch tools from this one to this new one. Well, that person who's in charge of change can then say, okay, well, great. This is our set of requirements for the objects that we need to be able to pull from a time entry, for example, and the naming conventions that need to be true. And so let's go evaluate that new tool you want to use. Let's run a few tests. Let's pull some sample data. Let me see if I can get that to match up with the stuff that we have, and de-risk a lot of these things before that transition is made. So we don't end up with this problem of whack-a-mole that we often run into in agencies, where it's like, we had this working for like 2 weeks and it was amazing. And ever since then, we've just been fixing all of the shit that's changing, and the system hasn't actually worked. And so we're doing 80% of the work and getting 0% of the value from the system, because there's always this little thing that's broken and it's bringing the whole thing down with it.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think you mentioned, identifying who's in charge. And I think that's really important, and also kind of segues into the third piece, which is cadence. And a lot of that ties into identifying responsible stakeholders and the frequency with which you're monitoring the inputs to the reporting system to get the optimal output. So, um,
And that's just to kind of come back to that for a moment. There is a relationship between the hygiene and the change process, where sometimes these changes aren't so monolithic, right? It's not like, oh, we're going to completely change the way that we're, you know, tracking time, or we're going to re-platform something. Sometimes it's something as simple as like, oh, we renamed client success to customer success. And that's something that is often just kind of going to get handled through a regular data hygiene process, because that would be as simple as writing a rule, an automated rule in your data hygiene system that says, if, task ID or task tag is one of these 6 variants of designer, just normalize it to design, for example. And like, this is what our platform for data hygiene does, is it gives us tools to do this stuff in the same way that QuickBooks gives bookkeepers tools to do these kinds of things to that data. So the data hygiene process in and of itself will cover off the vast majority of this change management organically. And it's those bigger, more monolithic changes that I think involve now the process of the cadences so that that stakeholder who's responsible for all of these things is hearing about this stuff before it happens and can get ahead of it, so it's not quite as disruptive and it doesn't take the system down for as long.
Yeah. I think that that's reassuring to so many of the folks that we work with, knowing that there is the opportunity to adapt to whatever change is at hand. They're not locked into, sticking with a certain project management platform. They're not locked into, XYZ practice. That's always been the case. They do have the flexibility to leverage our system to make those changes, as needed.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think this is a really important point. I think it's very easy to, when you're designing a system like this, fall into this mode of becoming, a change fighter, where especially if you've had the experience of like a change taking the whole system down, then you become really militant about like, no, we can't change anything. You try to create friction and avoid change because of all the cost and all the complexity that it comes with. But when you design the process from the start to be able to handle all of this change, then you become a change enabler. And the reality is change and the ability to change and do so quickly is a competitive advantage in business, and it puts you in a better position to be more resilient, to be more reactive. Change is a good thing a lot of the time. I think people conflate change with being bad because of the costs that it often comes with, but that's kind of the whole idea, right? Is we want to put a business in a position with the way that they report on things that they can handle change more fluidly. And in doing that, they can actually support all of the stakeholders that they're interacting with in continually iterating towards things that are better for them, and also make sure that that is still working for all the other people that rely on these reports. So that's just a really important idea, right? And a mindset shift that I think a lot of people have to go through, where it's like change isn't bad. It's not something we're trying to avoid. It's actually something we want to actively enable.
Yeah, 100%. So I think mindset is also a really key word here in terms of, again, cadence, which is the third piece. And it really is all about realigning all the core stakeholders across what used to be silos in the agency, sales, ops, project management, all kinds of different, factions in the agency, and bringing them together, establishing, what it is that we're objectively trying to achieve, looking at, knowing that we have the strong data, clean data, knowing that we have a framework that we've already agreed upon, and then getting a process in place to actually make decisions using, all this information. So what does Parakeeto's cadence, framework look like to the people that we work with?
It's going to vary from one client to the other. A lot of times it's going to come down to the scale of the agency. That's really going to determine, by and large, like how many different kind of meetings with different levels of stakeholders need to be involved. Another vector that will influence this is the nature of the work that they do. If they're a high volume shop that works on a lot of projects that start and end very quickly, then that often justifies a higher frequency of meeting. Whereas if they work on bigger, more monolithic projects, or they have, monthly retainers that are kind of closing every month, then, that might change the cadences. But by and large, our high level starting point is we want to at least have a monthly touch point with executive leadership to talk about the most important things in the business, which really all work back from what is the business's objective, right? It kind of comes back to our model, forecasts, feedback loop framework, right? So what do we agree were the goals and targets of the business that we know are achievable based on the model of the business? Are we on track to accomplish those things? If not, what adjustments might need to be made? And then, of course, with feedback loops, are there any assumptions that we're building our plan on that are fundamentally out of line with reality that we want to double click on? And that could be negative things, projects or people that are way off track, or it could be really positive things, services or products that we're selling that are far more profitable or far more efficient than we thought. So closing that feedback loop in service of solving the problem that is holding the business back to get to where they want to go is a really critical thing. And so practically what that often manifests in is things like questions of, should we be thinking about hiring people or making adjustments to our team? Scenario planning around, what if we do or don't close these big deals that are in the pipeline that we think might close? Like, how might we react to that? What kind of resourcing needs are we going to have? What does that actually look like? Conversations about, hey, should we be making adjustments to how we scope or price these different services? Conversations like, are there any opportunities for process improvement to help decrease the amount that we go over budget, or the let's say inconsistency of how much time goes into a certain type of work or a certain process within the business. These are a lot of the kinds of tactical things that might come out of these discussions, but it's all essentially rooted in making sure that everyone's aligned on where are we going, are we on track, and what's the number one focus that we all need to get aligned on in order to continue our progress towards that thing. And from there, you might see these reports cascade into other meetings with, increasingly granular or close to the work groups of stakeholders, such as middle management, project or account management, and in some cases even the broader team, looking at things like project performance, estimated versus actual hours, those kinds of things.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned at the beginning of the call, this is this last piece of the process setup, if you will. The cadences are the part where compliance tends to fall off, right? People kind of like get their system in place, they kind of set it and forget it, and then they don't get into this natural reoccurring rhythm where they're actually looking at what the data is telling them. What do you think is the cause for that, and what would you tell an agency who's kind of struggling with getting that rhythm in place?
So what's interesting is I actually think a lot of this is a manifestation of the system having been built without first answering the question of what are we even doing this for? What is the purpose of measuring these things in these metrics? What questions are we trying to answer? And more importantly than that, what decisions are we trying to enable or inform with this data? And from there, it should become clear, okay, well, how do we make these decisions? When are we having the conversations? Who's involved in those conversations? How often do those conversations happen? And that should really clarify what metrics are going to be important, what stakeholders are going to be important, in each of those meetings, and really what the intended impact of measuring this thing is going to be. And I think this level of thinking is a big part of the reason that we do certain things quite differently than conventional wisdom. Like top-down resource planning is a really good example of that. We have taken a radically different approach, and a lot of that is informed by this understanding of the exact meeting or conversation that we're trying to support with that system, which is a very dynamic, what if this happens, what if that happens kind of conversation that needs a system that is not super detailed and precise, but very quick to look at different things across and a lot simpler. So I think that's the first thing, right? Is really getting clear on what kind of decisions, questions, and conversations are we supporting here that we need data to support and enable, and then thinking about how often are we having those conversations. And that might bring you to the realization of like, hey, this is a really important thing that we just don't talk about often enough, like resourcing. If we're like, oh, it always feels like that's sneaking up on us that we need to hire someone. Okay, well, maybe that's something we should be talking about more proactively on a regular cadence. So get that meeting installed, and then it should become clear to you, okay, what kind of information is going to help us have a more effective conversation, with the end goal being that everybody is in alignment so that we can then actually execute on things. Because this is a really interesting thing. I really believe that one of the most important things that we're selling is not necessarily data, but it's the alignment that data helps create. And a lot of our clients, they don't necessarily struggle with not knowing what to do. They struggle with not being able to get everybody on the same page about what that is. And therefore, they don't take any action because they spend all their time arguing over what they think is going on and not enough time working together to say, let's go solve this problem as a team. And so that's, I think, the biggest impact that having regular cadences with structured conversation and data to support those conversations ends up having, is that the team is more aligned, and therefore they spend more of their time actually doing things about the problems that are holding the business back from getting to where they want to go.
Yeah. And is there a time of the month or a cadence in relation to kind of that retroactive financial lens where it makes sense for our clients to be looking at the operational data versus the cadence that they already have established with their accountant, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that those things are fairly decoupled in terms of data sets, and I think that's really an important thing. It's one of the big proponents of operational data as a concept for running the business, and also in the way that, again, we've architected our metrics. And on purpose, again, there's a lot of things that are counterintuitive where people are like, oh, wouldn't it be better if everything just like mapped exactly to financials? It's like, well, actually, one of the big bugs in that is that everything is now slowed to the pace of financials, which are really slow and very retroactive. And so um, there is a nice cadence where if you can have at the end of, let's say, each reporting cycle for your finances, which is probably going to be somewhere in the 2 to 4 weeks after the month is done range, you can have that land in line with your operational reports and kind of look at everything in one context. That's nice and it's convenient, but that's not a hill that I would be trying to die on. I would try to set a regular cadence for operations data, which can be much tighter than finance data because you're really just dealing with project, people, and time, and that stuff should be being produced at a much quicker clip. And oftentimes, if you, let's say, establish a bi-weekly cadence or a monthly cadence with that, your finance data is going to end up landing pretty close to that. And I would, again, be intentionally decoupling those things so that they're not reliant on each other. And that's a big part of the reason we like these ops metrics. And what they often also do, in my experience, is they really reduce the amount of reliance that we have on those financial data sets to tell us what's going on in the business. We're often not surprised and kind of know what to expect when we get the P&L because we've been paying attention to the leading indicators, which are, average billable rate, utilization, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And when it comes to, keeping the team or involving the team in this process, are there any like landmines or is there a level of granularity that you wouldn't recommend introducing to certain levels of team?
Yes, that's a great question. I think the first thing, and I've been very vocal about this in the past, is just don't put utilization in front of ICs. It's just not a good idea. When you really think about it for a moment, like unless you're in an environment where everything is billed by the hour and you can essentially bill clients for as much time as you want, and it doesn't matter, they're going to pay you for it anyway. So you're in a legal firm, for example, maybe you can get away with that. But let's say you're running an agency, chances are that's not going to be the case. And so in that context, only bad things will come from exposing utilization to your individual contributors, and especially trying to hold them accountable to a target. They're going to become incentivized to either lie on their timesheets, which is a horrible thing for you. It poisons your most important set of data to tell you what's going on in the business, and or they're going to be incentivized to spend more time than is necessary to get things done for clients, which again gives you an inaccurate data set, and then also makes your team feel busier than they actually are. Over time, it actually just obfuscates their sense of, how busy they are, how much work they actually have to do. It obfuscates your client's sense of how much, service they're actually expecting to get. So that's a really bad thing to do. Don't talk about utilization exclusively, and certainly not in terms of like targets with individual contributors. I would reserve utilization as a metric for management because really they're the ones that are in control of it. The other thing that I might avoid doing is jumping straight into the weeds with the ELT. So when you're talking about the highest level of leadership, I think it's really sometimes tempting to jump straight into the weeds and pull up, every single project that we're working on in the business and go through each of them. And that can often lead to a very unproductive discussion with leadership teams, especially the kind of leadership teams that are going to want to double click into everything. You're kind of getting into the forest, or you're getting into the trees without looking at the forest, so to speak. So with executive leadership, I would always recommend zooming all the way out to first principles and starting with the highest level things. Like, okay, let's reset on our goals, our objectives. Has anything changed there? Great. Now let's like start at the very highest level with a forecast, and then start to work back towards the number one focus, and then only get into details as it relates to supporting whatever is necessary to get to a clear next step for solving the problem or achieving the objective. Those would be my two kind of first thoughts on what to avoid. Is don't get in the weeds too much with ELT, and don't talk about utilization with your lower level team. And I would say if you're going to be biased towards any metric with like the individual contributors in the business, I would say over index on average billable rate, especially in a context where you bill in a way that isn't tied to time. If I want the team to be over indexing on anything, it's efficiency. And that metric is going to incentivize over indexing on efficiency, which, of all the things that you can be lopsided on, that's probably the healthiest one.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of what you're saying is kind of coming from the perspective of like the CEO being in charge or owning this, reporting system. And I'm wondering if for all the operators listening out there, if they're the ones who are kind of leading the charge here, how do we set the stage from a process standpoint to basically set expectations up, manage up?
Yeah, I think this gets into stakeholder management kind of 101. It starts with, again, getting really clear on what the goals and priorities are for the business, and trying to make those things as objective and measurable as possible, making sure that we're tapped into the cadences where those things are being discussed and changed, and that if we can't be involved in those conversations, that we're at least downstream from those conversations and being able to capture what's changing so it can inform how we support that initiative with this reporting. And then often we're, for better for worse, going to end up being the middleman that's trying to reconcile those changes that are happening at the upper level of the organization with what's happening on the ground floor, closer to delivery. So to me, it kind of comes back to the same thing I just mentioned with executive leadership. Is you always have to keep your eye on the highest level conversation that's happening in the business in terms of objectives and direction, and then work backwards in terms of how to support that with the kinds of agendas that you use to facilitate meetings, maybe even the cadences that are happening, the stakeholders that are involved, and the metrics that you bring up to support those conversations. That would be my general advice for the operators in the room. And I think you could speak to this too, Kristen. I'd be curious what you would add to that, if anything.
Yeah, no, you mentioned, going back to the basics of change management. Yeah, I think starting small first, introducing the stakeholders to the why we're picking these metrics to keep a high level view on, so that they're aware and have that, basic buy-in. And then I think it really is just about making it predictable for, your executive, right? So making sure that you set the expectation that we're looking at this at a certain frequency. Here's what we're going to be deciding against based on our objectives. Just the expectation setting and keeping that very consistent. So those would be two things that I would definitely focus on from an operational standpoint, for sure.
I think that surfaces like two things that I'll add to this as well, which is conveniently, we have proposed a model that I think makes a lot of sense in terms of how to sequence building this kind of muscle inside the organization. And and this is the process that we follow with all of our clients. We start with a model of the business, which is often, the most appropriate tool for facilitating the conversation around what are our goals, what are our objectives, what are our targets, and how do we align those across the key areas of the business, being, sales and leadership, operations and delivery, and in particular looking at like team composition, expectations from that team, and then of course finance and the budgets that we're setting at finance. So having a model, and if you want to learn more about the model, we'll leave links to share more information about that in the show notes. But having a model that you can literally use to do the math in real time in that meeting is a really powerful and simple tool, and it starts to introduce a lot of these concepts in a really palatable way, and people can see the relationship between them. From there, you get into forecasting. So, okay, we've agreed on what we want to do. Now it's like, are we on track? And how do the decisions we're making change our trajectory towards that thing is kind of the next step. And then, of course, you get to the last and most complicated one, which is the feedback loop. So, here are all the assumptions that we made in our model and our forecast. How did things play out relative to those assumptions? And where are the biggest gaps between our expectations and reality, which will help often inform execution. So that sequencing, I think, is really important. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is where you touched on a little bit, which I think is important, is trying to keep the leadership team focused, and in particular, protecting them from their tendency to want to get in the weeds on things or go down rabbit holes or make things more complicated than they need to be. We deal with all these different stakeholders, as clients, and our most successful clients are the ones that have a really strong ops or project management person that's really owning this process. And it's actually not the highest level executives in the business that are responsible for data hygiene and data input and all these things. And a really important role that we play in that process is pushing back on the client when they want to do something that's setting them up for failure. And the most common example of that is they want to make things really precise and detailed. And I understand where that's coming from, but when we push back and say, okay, well, how is I going to help you answer this question in a more accurate way or in a more timely way or on a more frequent basis? And then we evaluate that against the cost and complexity and risk of adding all of that additional work and friction to the system. Then often they're able to say, oh yeah, okay, I could see how this is actually not going to help us get to where we want to go. And actually it might hold us back. So you have to have in some cases, confidence and the soundness of mind to be able to stop when the CEO is like, I want to know how much time was spent on the subtask within the task, within the milestone, within the deliverable, within the phase, within the project, within the account, within the client, for every single thing that we've ever worked on, to be like, interesting. Tell me more about why. What question are you hoping that's going to help you answer? What decision do you think that's going to help us make? And often, you're able to kind of walk them back to a much more reasonable, low cost and feasible option. That's such a huge part of this process piece, really, is the process of keeping the whole system maintainable and functional over time and fighting against unnecessary complexity. That is the most common reason, I would say, that people fail to be successful here.
Yeah. And I think, a benchmark for, these cadences being implemented correctly would be having shorter meetings, right? So I think that, Parakeeto, drinking our own Kool-Aid, I think has some of the shortest discussions sometimes around these, operational decisions, because we're able to just at a glance take a look at the information we need, high level. That's a 5 to 10 minute discussion as opposed to this half-hour discussion. And I can think of nothing more probably refreshing to an executive than saying, hey, once we get into a really good rhythm here, a really good cadence, you can get time in your day back.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about this the other day, right? I was actually feeling a little bit of insecurity because I was like, why don't we spend more time in our own reports? And then I thought about it some more, and I was like, this is a funny trap to fall into, right? Is conflating the amount of value that you get from a report from the amount of time that you spend looking at it, when it's actually the inverse that's true. The fact that we can pick up one report, look at it for 5 minutes on our weekly sync, and we all know exactly what's going on and exactly what we need to do, that is incredible, right? That is the value, the fact that it's that quick. Or even at, our last offsite, we might've spent 15 minutes talking about our goals and targets because it was just that quick, and then a couple of changes might happen. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Okay, great. It's so fast, and it's all the time we didn't spend. That's so much of the value that's being unlocked, because that time now gets deployed against, all right, well, what are we going to do as a team to go and move in this direction? And so that's a really great point, right? Is let's not conflate time spent looking at reports with value. And in fact, the opposite is probably a good indicator. The less time you need to spend, the less data you need to look at to get clear on what you need to do and just start moving. That's really what we're after here.
So we've talked about, the value. Maybe all of this sounds a little bit overwhelming to someone who's listening. What would you say would be just the first step to getting started with a process in place?
I would say the first step, and this really should precede kind of if you're working on building a system like this in your agency or changing tools or trying to improve the reporting, is start with that question of, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? What decisions, what conversations, what, questions are we trying to support? with this data, start there and start to work back. And it should actually take a lot of the scariness out of answering some of these questions around what the systems need to look like, how often we need to be reporting on these things, what kind of change or hygiene issues we might need to anticipate in the process. So that would be step one, I think, is sit down and really peel it back to first principles, get clear on those things, get aligned on those things with your stakeholders, and you'll be in a much better position to start working through all the nuances that aren't going anywhere, but hopefully will be less daunting with that strong foundation in place.
This has really been a really good conversation around our three-pronged approach. I love bringing it home with the process, my favorite out of all three of them. Really good, thorough deep dive on process today.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad that we spent some time digging into this, and I hope that one of the key takeaways from those that are listening is like, this is a job that needs to exist. So whether you're a person that wants to believe that that's not true, you want to believe that you can just kind of set up a platform that automates all of this and just automatically grabs all your data and throws it into a dashboard. Hopefully this has helped you understand that that's not really feasible today. I wish it was, but it's not. And so you need to plan for this, and hopefully this helps you set better expectations with your team and resource them better. And conversely, if you're an ops person that's been tasked with this and you feel like you've been set up for failure, hopefully this gives you, a resource to forward to your colleagues, or just, some confidence to broach this conversation around, here's the best practice that actually needs to be in place for this to function and the scope that really entails. So you can move forward and be better as a team and really just support all the initiatives that this data is important to supporting.
Short meetings for the win.
For the win. And on that note, we'll do a short podcast for the win. 40 minutes, not that short to be talking about this stuff, but short enough. We certainly could talk longer. So with all of that, I want to thank you, Kristen, for bringing this topic to the show, for a great interview. And I want to thank the audience, everyone that's listening, for tuning in. We always appreciate you listening. And if you got something from the episode, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to let us know what you learned, what questions you have, and be sure to check out the show notes for lots of free resources to help you implement what you learned today. We'll see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.